Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Mark Rathbone. I'm at the Northwest University Faculty of Economic Management Sciences and Professor of Business Ethics, along with my colleague Dr. Danielle Fourie. And it's a great privilege for us to introduce Professor Derek Leben from the Tepper School of Business. We actually met in 2022 at the International Society of Business, Economics and Ethics Conference in Spain. And yeah, we didn't believe then that artificial intelligence would end up being what it is today, only a couple of years later. So we decided to invite Professor Leben to share with us his insights on fairness, ethics, in terms of algorithms and artificial intelligence. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He published numerous articles, and he wrote a book in 2018 on robots, ethics for robots, and he is finalizing a publication for this year, 2024, on AI fairness. So we really would like to learn from you. And his fields of specialization focus obviously on ethics and fairness, but its application specifically in terms of autonomous systems and algorithms. And he also consults with the private sector. So his insights are not only abstract and theoretical, it's practical, and that's what we would like to share with our students as well. So thank you that we can record this. It's going to go out to quite a wide audience. So we really appreciate your time. We know it's 10 o'clock in the morning there. It's 4 o'clock here in South Africa. But we appreciate giving us this opportunity and sparing some time to spend with us. The floor is open for you, and you can continue with your presentation. We'll give opportunity for questions afterwards. But as we say, it's also going to be recorded. So if we can continue to dialogue with you, engage with you through our students as well, because they have a big interest in especially the artificial intelligence systems. So we would like to learn from you and share our experiences as well in future. So the floor is yours, Professor Leben. Welcome.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and make my PowerPoint full screen and assume that all of us can see this okay. I just see the PowerPoint here from my perspective, so hopefully all of you can see this all right. So the structure of the talk is as follows. I'm going to start out with a few introductory remarks about what AI is, what kinds of applications it has in business, and what the ethical challenges are, specifically what sorts of ethical challenges I talk about in my class called Ethics in AI. Then we're going to narrow down on fairness, talk about what fairness is, the problem of fairness for AI systems that make decisions, that move around in the world, that generate text and images. I will give a theory of algorithmic justice that I'm going to be describing in more detail in my book that's coming out later this year from MIT Press. And then finally, I'll wrap up by applying the theory to some actual examples. So let's start out. The word AI is used to describe pretty much everything right now. Anything involving computers or algorithms is labeled AI. But let's try and do a little better than that. If you ask 5 different people, even experts in AI, to define the term, you will get 5 different answers. There's a lot of disagreement about what AI actually is. And so what I like to do is put together what philosophers call a sufficient definition. That is something that makes everyone happy. This is a big tent definition that is going to bring together a lot of different ideas. Most people are going to disagree that all of this is actually necessary, but at least it's going to be sufficient to please everyone. So first of all, AI is any system that uses a complex model, which is trained on a big data set, usually with machine learning methods. Although back in the olden days of the 20th century, AI did not used to incorporate machine learning methods. The systems were actually hand designed by data scientists and engineers. Now, almost always, we use machine learning methods because these kinds of models have millions or billions of parameters in them. They perform human-like actions, which are things like driving a car, recognizing a face or an image, producing language, making judgments and decisions. These are all human-like actions and decisions. And finally, they perform them with minimal human supervision. So there's a range of autonomy that an agent could have. For example, with a self-driving car, you could have a system like Tesla's autopilot, which moves around in the world, but you need to keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road. Or you could have other autonomous vehicles that have more autonomy, like those developed by Cruise and Waymo, where there's no steering wheel needed. They could just drive around and you don't need to intervene. So this is going to be the definition of AI that we work with here in our discussion. There's a lot of different types of machine learning that are used over big data sets. We're not going to worry too much about all these different kinds of machine learning. However, we are going to distinguish different kinds of actions that AI systems can take. So I like to distinguish between systems that make predictions, that is, they make a label like approve your loan or reject your loan. These are sometimes called predictive AI systems. Then there are systems that generate new strings of text or new images or new audio strings. These are called generative AI systems. And finally, there's AI systems that move around in the world. We used to call these robots, but now we could just call these embodied AI systems, like self-driving cars, like maybe household robots like Tesla's Optimus, that's being designed to do things like fold laundry and do our dishes. There are lots of applications of AI to business, to products, and even to operations within the business. So there's applications for media and marketing. You could generate images, you could generate copy, you could generate text, you could incorporate AI into your customer service chatbots. There's applications in finance and lending. A lot of companies are using AI to make credit and lending decisions about people and even make recommendations about stock trading. There's applications in hiring and HR. There are some companies like HireVue that are incorporating AI into the hiring and interview process. Other companies like LinkedIn are incorporating it into recruiting. And we've seen even Meta incorporate AI into the job advertising process. There's applications in engineering and software engineering. I myself use large language models mostly to code in my demos. I find it fantastically helpful in doing that. There's obviously applications in transportation. The self-driving car and self-driving truck industry has been moving steadily since the early 2000 teens. And finally, in healthcare, there's applications. The idea that you could take an AI system to try to make diagnoses, like, for instance, is this image cancer or not cancer? That's a kind of predictive system, or that you could use an AI system to try to make recommendations about treatment. That would be a generative AI application of healthcare AI in healthcare. And so with all of these applications come both legal and ethical challenges. And a number of organizations, nonprofit groups, governments, and even private companies have, for the last few years, been developing policies about how to deploy these technologies in a safe and responsible way. Here is an overview from a meta-analysis a few years ago from the Berkman Klein Center, which looks at hundreds of documents developed by organizations and identifies a set of important principles or values that are common across all of these documents. These include things like data ownership and use, explainability, discrimination and fairness, safety, and responsibility. So these are the kinds of issues that a company needs to be able to address when they are deploying AI in some kind of service, in their products, in their operations. They need to have a policy around what does it mean for this AI system to be safe, to be fair, to be explainable, where does the data come from, and so on. For example, if you are using AI to make lending decisions in your company, you need to say, okay, where does the data come from that we use to train our model? Where does the data come from that we use to actually deploy our model? And do we get that in a respectful way? Do we ask people's consent? Do they know what data is being used? Do they have control over that data? Is this model explainable? In some places like the United States, there are laws like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act from the 1970s, which say that if you are rejecting someone for a loan, you need to provide an explanation for why. But nobody really knows right now what that means when it comes to AI systems. It's very difficult to explain the decisions of some of these systems because they are very, very complex. And so if you just say, well, we used a neural network that was trained on big data with a machine learning procedure, and your application was judged by this system to be similar to other people's applications who were rejected in the past, that doesn't seem like a good kind of explanation. Instead, it seems like we want more from the system. And so a company needs to say, okay, what do we consider to be a minimally acceptable explanation when we are using an AI system to reject you for a loan or evaluate your credit or evaluate you for a job or something like this? Similarly, AI systems that are trained on historical data sets, these historical data sets contain inequalities. And because of that, these systems will usually replicate those inequalities in its decisions. And so the company needs to say, how are we auditing our systems to make sure that they are free of bias? And also, how are we ensuring that its decisions are fair with respect to different kinds of protected groups? Finally, you need to say something like, okay, what are the levels of safety that we consider to be minimally safe in our system? If you're putting this system out for doctors to use, for lawyers to use, if this is a self-driving car, you need to say, how many mistakes do we consider to be acceptable? What kinds of mistakes do we stand by? If a doctor uses this AI system and it makes a mistake, do we blame the doctor? Do we blame the hospital? Do we blame the company? The company needs to come out and say, here's what we think we are responsible for. Here's what we think we are not responsible for. Here's the minimal level of safety and so on. And so in my class, what we do is we identify all of these ethical challenges. We talk about, here are some different policy solutions. So one company might have this policy A, another company might have that policy B, a third company might have another policy C. What are the range of different policy solutions that companies could have for what makes an AI system safe and explainable and fair and so on? And finally, we look at normative arguments from ethics, from law, from political philosophy, and we try to give arguments about why we should prefer one of these policies to the other. Because ultimately, that's what ethics is all about, is trying to defend your judgments, to defend your company's policy, and justify it in the face of alternatives, right? Now, this does draw on legal ideas often. And in my class, we often draw on important laws, like I mentioned, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, anti-discrimination laws, product safety and liability laws. However, the law is not really going to help in many cases. First of all, because laws are often vague and it's up to companies to interpret how they are complying with those laws. Second of all, because when we're dealing with new technologies, the law is sometimes just non-existent. Now, we've seen some recent advances, most notably the AI Act that was recently passed by the European Union Parliament. However, once again, if you're not doing business in Europe, or even if you are, you have a lot of leeway here to determine what constitutes compliance with these laws. And so what I really focus on is for companies to step up and be as detailed as possible in their arguments and say, here's what we think constitutes safety, fairness, explainability. Here's what we think would be actually permissible for us to do as a company. Okay, so that was all by way of introduction. And now I'd like to go ahead and narrow down on just one of these ethical challenges, namely the problem of fairness in AI. So I'm going to talk about fairness because I think this is really at the heart of a lot of the ethical challenges. Also because I just wrote a book about it, so I have a lot to say. I'm going to illustrate the problem of fairness by looking at 3 different examples of AI, one of them for making decisions about lending, the other one for driving vehicles, and a third for generating images. So I think a good place to start with talking about fairness is actually with the law. And in the United States, there are 2 different kinds of discrimination laws, or I should say 2 different parts of discrimination law. One of them has to do with the way that people are treated, or you might think of it as the process of a decision. And the other one has to do with outcomes, which is called disparate impact. Parity, of course, just means equality, and so disparate just means any kind of process or outcome which is unequal. So when it comes to treatment or process, usually in the US, the laws that are appealed to here are the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution and various case laws around it. And so in this definition, we say that a person has been discriminated against where there is some adverse treatment against them. That is some kind of deprivation of a good, some kind of harm on the basis of their membership in a protected group. And in the US, there's a set of these protected groups that are defined by law. They include things like age, race, gender, disability, and so on. Now, from an ethical perspective, we want to dive a little deeper and ask, why is it that we care about protected groups? Why is it that we care about avoiding decisions that are on the basis of membership in a protected group? And one reason has to do with historical oppression. That if women, for instance, have been systematically deprived of access to wealth and to education and to power and job opportunities in the past, then we care very much about protecting their ability in the future to access those social goods. Now, when it comes to impact, this has more to do with outcomes rather than the process. And the legal basis for this in the US is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed in 1964. And a lot of this really doesn't care so much about the process itself, but rather about the outcome. And so you could say something like, as an employer, well, I am blind. I'm not looking at age, race, gender, disability. I'm not using those in my decision process. But if there's a historical inequality, say, in education that leads some candidates, say male candidates are more qualified than female candidates in the application pool, you could have inequalities in the outcome, even if you're not using gender explicitly as a feature in your decision-making process. And so I'm going to talk about both of these aspects in some of these examples with AI. So let's start out with using AI for credit and lending decision. There are a lot of companies that do this. Classically, you have companies like the FICO Corporation in the United States, which in the 1950s developed this scoring system, which is just a simple kind of, we call it a regression model, a linear regression model, where essentially you have these 6 categories of data about people, things like how many late payments they have and how much credit they have on file currently. And you add all of these scores up, using a set of weights, and you get a final score, and that's your credit score. And this is a very simple kind of model. But in the last few decades, a lot of companies have been looking at big data sets that include not just standardly financial information, but what's called alternative credit data. Things like data from your social media activity, your purchase and browsing history, your utility bills, even your telecom data, like how long you make a call at night, the frequency of your calling behavior, your geolocation data. And so obviously all of this involves ethical challenges having to do with data usage and collection. Do people really understand that this data is being used to make credit judgments about them? Do they consent to this? But let's assume all of that is satisfied. Let's assume that consumers really do understand that this data is being used to make credit decisions about them. Even if that's the case, opening up the door to big data and machine learning procedures over big data will introduce the possibility that these machine learning procedures discover certain relationships, statistical relationships that we don't want them to discover. So for instance, in the US, there are well-known inequalities when it comes to race and gender and wealth and income. Now, if you use a machine learning procedure over big data, it's going to inevitably discover those kinds of relationships. So if you have, for example, race or gender in the data set, the machine learning procedure might discover that there's a correlation between, say, race or gender and wealth and income, and it might use that feature as a predictive variable to make decisions about a person. And that's an obvious example of what we might call disparate treatment. That's something we don't want the system to be doing. Now, you might say, well, here's a solution, an easy solution. Just remove those features from the data set. Let's just make sure we don't have age, race, gender, disability in the training data, in the input data that applicants give to the company, and the model is blind. And so we don't have to worry about that. The problem is there are these variables that we call proxy variables, which are highly correlated with protected features. And a machine learning procedure, even if it doesn't see race or gender, it will learn to pick up on those proxy variables and use them. Now, even if it doesn't, well, I should say, even if you try to remove all of the proxy variables, you still get these kinds of disparate impact problems, which is to say that if there's a relationship between, say, race and gender and income and wealth, then you will have these kinds of inequalities replicated in the decisions of the model. And so if we're just looking at salary, for example, and we use salary to predict who's going to repay a loan, and that's our one feature we use in our data set, in the US, there's this well-known, and in many other countries, there are well-known inequalities based on ethnicity, race, political and religious affiliation, and salary and wealth. And so what's going to happen in that model is it's going to wind up indirectly, we might say, discriminating against members of those groups. Because if it learns to pick up on, say, salary, and there's an inequality based on, say, race and salary in the US, then it's going to approve far more applications from white Americans than Black Americans. And because of that, you're going to get disparate impact, even if the model was only paying attention to salary and not race. Now, is that discrimination? Maybe not in the classical sense. It's not disparate treatment, but it certainly is disparate impact in the sense that your model is now approving more applications from white Americans than Black Americans because there's this pre-existing inequality. Now, some ethical theories are going to say, well, that's very unfortunate, but we as a company are not responsible for that. We as a company are not responsible for going in and correcting historical injustices. We are responsible for making sure that our decisions themselves are free of bias. But we have no responsibility to make sure that they are fair in the broader sense of fairness. And so this is really where the fairness debate comes in. Let's take another example with navigation systems. Now, you might think this is an extremely different example, but I'm going to try to show that it relates to the same kinds of ethical problems. If you were designing a navigation system for, say, self-driving cars, You have to make decisions in the design of that system about how to allocate risk. And by that, I mean things like how closely are you going to drive to other vehicles, to bicyclists, to pedestrians? How much distance are you going to put between you and other vehicles? Those kinds of decisions. And those kinds of decisions are ethical decisions, I want to claim. And you can think about the distribution of risk as a kind of fair distribution problem. Now, when we talk about making these kinds of navigation decisions, we can ask what features should be relevant. Should we care about whether the pedestrian is an adult, say, or a child? Should we drive slower around pedestrians who are children compared to pedestrians who are adults? Should we care about whether this person is jaywalking or not jaywalking? By the way, in the US, I don't know if this phrase is used in other countries. Jaywalking just means crossing the street when you're not legally allowed to in a crosswalk. Just making sure. So these are the questions of equal treatment. And we want to ask what kinds of features should be used, should be relevant in making those decisions. On the left, I have a diagram from an experiment that's become fairly notorious called the moral machine experiment, run by some researchers who were at MIT at the time. And they gave a set of experiments involving collisions, and these collisions alternated the features of people in those collisions, like is it male or female, are they children or adults, are they animals or humans, and asked, okay, which kinds of features are going to have an impact, a change on people's decision making. And this winds up making its way into laws. So for example, one German law about autonomous vehicles says that an autonomous vehicle needs to be able to distinguish between humans and animals, animals, and objects. So we might think this is a relevant decision, but that gender is not, even if human beings psychologically are more willing to collide with men than women. I would argue that that's not a relevant feature that should be used in a navigation system. And actually, it would be discrimination if a navigation system was more likely to collide with a group of men than a group of women. Now, when it comes to disparate impact, what we want to know is, okay, are the collisions, are the harms of a navigation system distributed equally and fairly across different groups? And how should we make those decisions? The last example of fairness in AI that I want to focus on has to do with generative AI. So I talked about one case study with predictive AI for lending, one case study with embodied AI for autonomous vehicles, and now let's talk about generative AI for systems that generate images or text or video and audio strings. So when we talk about, say, disparate treatment or disparate impact in these systems, usually what we have in mind is there's some kind of inequality in the images that we have, which is called labeling bias, or there's some kind of inequality in the world itself, which you might just call inequality in the data. So this image on the right is from an article in 2015 about Google image search. And it was describing how if you type in doctor in Google Images, you get a result that's mostly men, and you see also mostly white men too. And so in this case, we have disparate impact because number one, there's labeling bias. There just aren't as many images of women doctors. And number two, there's actually inequality in the world itself. So when we talk about, say, gender and race in the actual data in the world, in the US, women are about a third of doctors, despite being 50% of the population, and Black Americans are about 6% of doctors, despite being 14% of the US population. Now, that inequality is not in the labels, but in the world itself. But they are both causes of disparate impact. But from an ethical perspective, a company needs to say, which of those inequalities do we care about mitigating, right? When our image system is generating a generic image of a doctor, should it be 50% men and 50% women? Or should it be, say, 37% women and 63% men to reflect the actual state of the world? Or should we just do no mitigations at all, in which case it's even going to be fewer than 30% female images because we just have fewer images of women in the training data for the model. And so once again, a company can't just remain neutral about this. They need to say, here's our fairness policy. Now, Google and OpenAI, for a brief period of time, did in their image generators try to mitigate this bias, but it wound up producing something that we might call reverse effects, or sometimes also called reverse discrimination when we're talking about decisions, which is when you asked the image generator to generate images of like American founding fathers, it would generate images of half women, half men, even though there were no women American founding fathers. That's not because women are not patriotic or didn't support the American Revolution. It's because they weren't allowed to be at the time. And so when we talk about mitigations, you're going to introduce gender and race in the system in order to correct for those inequalities. And the company also needs to say, do we consider that to be discrimination in treatment or not? So these are all the kinds of challenges that companies need to face when they're using AI for making decisions, for moving around in the world, or for generating strings of text or images having to do with fairness. Okay, so the second part of the talk will now try to provide some kind of theoretical grounding for companies to make decisions around these kinds of challenges. I want to say that a company needs a theoretical grounding. You can't just have a policy because you think it sounds good. You have to have some kinds of reasons and defend your policy with those reasons. And so let's go ahead and take a step back and explore fairness in general from the perspective of theories of fairness in philosophy, in economics, in political philosophy. And I want to start out with an example from the Nobel Prize winning economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. And he tells the following story, which he calls the story of the flute. So imagine there's a father who has a flute. In economics, this is called an indivisible good. You can't chop it up. And he wants to leave it to one of his sons. He has 4 sons in his will. But he doesn't know which son to leave it to, and all 4 sons want the flute equally. They all have some kind of claim to the flute. Let's say I'm adapting the story a little bit here for my own purposes. Let's say the first son made the flute and cleaned it every day. He didn't do this of his own free will. His father told him to. That was one of his chores, but he put in the work, he put in the effort every day cleaning and maintaining the flute. Son number 2 has the flute by cultural tradition. Let's say there's some tradition in their society that you always leave musical instruments to the second son. This wasn't actually a contract or a promise that the father made to the son. However, it's a kind of expectation the son has. The third son is the best flute player. Let's assume actually none of the other sons are even good at playing the flute and probably won't play it at all. But the third son is very good at playing the flute, and he will play it and bring happiness to all the land with his melodic flute playing. The fourth son is the poorest one and has no other toys. He's very sad because of this. He's out there in the back digging in the mud with sticks, and all of the other sons are playing with their toys. If the father leaves the flute to the fourth son, then the fourth son will be very happy. You might think the fourth son is brought up to the same level of functioning as all the other sons. Now, usually in my class, what I do is a poll, and I ask the students, which of these sons should we leave the flute to? And also, we have a fifth option, which is to randomize. You could simply roll a 4-sided die and leave the flute to whichever son it lands on. Now, each of these options has its own kind of normative justification. On the side of the first son, you have theories of justice which you might say are based on desert, and sometimes on correcting for historical injustice or historical effort and contribution. And so he put in the work, he put in hours of work to maintain and clean the flute. He deserves some compensation, some recognition for those efforts. The second son has it by, you might say, procedural fairness. If we just go with tradition, with custom, then we might say, without paying attention to features of the children, we will give the second son the flute. You might also use randomization as a kind of procedural fairness outcome. Finally, these other sons, number 3 and 4, have the flute by justification of what we call distributive justice principles. Distributive justice just means we are thinking about how to allocate resources for future benefits. And when it comes to future benefits, we could measure these in terms of overall happiness, where the son that is the best flute player might bring the most happiness to the most people. Or we might think about future benefits in terms of preventing the worst outcomes, maximizing the worst off. In this case, we would give it to the fourth son. Now, I'm not going to worry about jargon like utilitarian and prioritarian here, but instead I'm just going to point out that these different fairness principles will say different things about what constitutes fair decisions in cases like this. Now, we could apply these fairness principles to economic problems as well, to distributing fixed resources like revenue from a firm, from a joint venture. And in a class that I teach, or I'm going to teach this coming year at Tepper called Fairness in Business, we're going to take these fairness principles and apply them to economic problems of fair prices, fair wages, and fair resource allocation. So for example, if we have Alice and Bob both contributing to a joint venture, let's say Alice puts in $50 in her original investment and Bob puts in $100 in original investment, and there's a total revenue of $210 from this joint revenue and from this joint venture. And the whole operation shuts down. It's like a lemonade stand. It was a temporary venture. How should they distribute the $210? Well, an egalitarian would say you should split it evenly between them. Egal just means fair in Latin, and so equal in Latin. And so the equal way of distributing these shares is just to split the $210 evenly, 105 to Alice and 105 to Bob. On the other hand, you might think, well, Bob contributed twice as much of the investment as Alice. He should get twice as much of the revenue. And so that means you take 2/3 of the revenue and give it to Bob, and 1/3 of the revenue and give it to Alice. Now, what if I changed the story a little bit and said that Alice worked twice as hard as Bob did? Well, some desert principles based on effort will actually say maybe now she should get twice as much of the revenue as him because she put in twice as much of the effort. And so when you talk about desert, a lot of this really hinges on what are people owed and how do you figure out what they are owed in terms of their past effort, their past contribution. Finally, if we're using distributive principles, we might say, well, we're going to figure out what their utility functions are. How much happiness do they get from some additional dollar, for the marginal benefit that they get from each additional dollar that you give them? And if Alice has like a really steep utility function that then flattens out where she gets a lot of happiness from a small amount of dollars and then not much happiness from additional dollars, that you should actually give Alice a small amount of money and give Bob all the rest because it's going to create most happiness. On the other hand, you might say, well, what is going to create the best outcomes in terms of maximizing the minimum? So let's say that Alice is actually very poor and Bob is very rich. Maybe you care about bringing her up to some kind of minimal level of functioning, and then you might run another kind of fairness principle called maximin over these outcomes. Now, what I want to do here is think about in more detail, because we'll see this later when it comes to autonomous vehicles, the difference between these two distributive justice principles. So let's assume for now that we have two different paths that an autonomous vehicle could take, path A and path B. And each of these paths has some predicted harm that it's going to do to 3 different vehicles in the path. So in path A, there's some estimated harm of, let's say, a 6% chance of death for vehicle 1, a 5% chance of death for vehicle 2, and a 4% chance of death for vehicle 3. Whereas in path B, there is a 1% chance of death for vehicle 1, a 1% chance of death for vehicle 2, and a 9% chance of death for vehicle 3. Which of these paths has the best outcomes in terms of minimizing overall harm? Well, it actually depends on whether we are adding them all up together or whether we are picking the worst outcome and maximizing the minimum. So if we are adding them all up together, which is sometimes called the utilitarian distributive justice principle, then we see in path A, the total amount of risk that you impose on these vehicles is 6% plus 5% plus 4%, which is 15%. So that's a total of negative 15, you might say. And it depends on how we're interpreting these numbers. But let's say it's negative 15 on sort of a number scale of harm and benefit. Now in path B, if we add all these up together, we get negative 1 plus negative 1 plus negative 9, which equals negative 11. Now, which of these is better, negative 15 or negative 11? It turns out negative 11 is better. And so path B actually has the best outcomes. It minimizes the most total harm. The most amount of risk, or the most total risk in path A is 15% total risk. The total risk in path B is 11% total risk. And so path B has the least amount of total risk. Now, if we're talking about minimizing the worst harms, the worst harm in path A is actually for vehicle 1, which is a 6% chance of death. The worst harm in path B is actually 9% chance of death for vehicle 3. What is better there, a 6% chance of death or a 9% chance of death? It's a 6% chance of death. So if we're running this alternative idea of maximizing the minimum or maxi-min, we're actually going to prefer path A to path B. Because even though it has the most total risk involved, the worst risk is lower in path A than the worst risk is in path B. So hopefully you all stuck with me through that, because it's going to come into play when we talk about autonomous vehicles later. Now, I will just cut to the chase here and reveal my own proposal for what I call an algorithmic theory of justice. This is what I present in the book that's coming out this year called AI Fairness. And so what I develop in that book is a version of a theory of justice from the American philosopher John Rawls. In John Rawls' theory of justice, he has a set of tiered principles which he thinks all rational agents would agree to in an original position of fairness, which just means if you don't know who you're going to be, what would all people agree to in this kind of hypothetical bargaining position? And I am refining these ideas. I think that Rawls is essentially correct about his method of figuring out which principles are fair. And I am refining these ideas for specific application to AI systems. And so what I do here in these principles is think about, first of all, autonomy, which just means essentially guaranteeing everybody a minimal level of functioning and not interfering with their functioning that currently exists. Now, with AI systems, what this means is a minimal level of safety and accuracy in systems. And each of these is a tiered principle, just like, say, Asimov's laws of robotics, where you start out, you must obey principle 1, and you must obey principle 2 unless it interferes with principle 1, and then you must obey principle 3 unless it interferes with principles 1 or 2. So principle 1 is essentially a kind of non-interference, minimal functioning kind of principle. It says everyone is guaranteed a minimal level of accuracy and safety from these systems. But 2 and 3 is really where fairness comes in, and we see the aspects of both treatment and impact that I'm drawing on US discrimination law to actually provide. So principle 2 is about equal treatment. Here we care about ensuring that protected features, especially those features which have been the tools of historical oppression, like gender and race and religious attitudes, are not playing a causal role in your decision about someone. Now, what does it mean for a feature to play a causal role? That's actually a complicated story. One good way of establishing this is using certain kinds of explainable AI methods, which are going to reveal causal role, or you might call them counterfactual role in the model. And so what you do is you ask something like, if I were to change this feature in the model, would that change the outcome of the decision or not? And I claim that we care very much about the causal role of protected features. But it's not only protected features that we care about, what we classically call non-discrimination. It's also ensuring that the features which do play a causal role in a decision about lending, about hiring, about even education and criminal justice, that these features are under people's control. And so if you are using features in your model that are things like how often people make calls at night or parents' level of education, these are things that you might think are not relevant or are not the kinds of things that people have control over. Now, the problem is with machine learning and big data, a lot of these systems are going to discover these relationships. Like maybe it turns out that the parents of divorced children are actually less likely to repay a loan than the parents of the children of married parents. But should that be something that we are using to make lending or hiring decisions about a person? Even if it's statistically relevant, even if a machine learning procedure discovers that in its training phase, should we be allowing the model to make those kinds of decisions based on those features? I claim no, that would be a discrimination example, not in the classical sense of protected features like gender and race, but instead, it would be using features that are irrelevant or shouldn't have causal impact in our decision. The last set of aspects of this theory of algorithmic justice have to do with equal outcomes and equal impact. And here I want to say that a model is fair whenever it provides equal recognition, regardless of group membership, to people. That is a kind of desert principle, what Rawls called a principle of entitlement, where we say, okay, we're going to acknowledge that each person, regardless of membership in a group like gender or race or disability, should have equal opportunity to have their qualifications rewarded and recognized. The other aspect of this is the most radical idea down at the bottom, and it's equal realization of potential. It's the idea that people who have been deprived of what they otherwise would have accomplished if not for historical oppression, they should also have the opportunity to have those potential qualifications realized, not just their actual qualifications recognized. Now, all of this gets very philosophically subtle very fast, but I'm not going to really dwell on all of the philosophical aspects here. Instead, I'm just going to jump right now in the third part to, if you agree with this theory of justice, if you agree that this is a good approach for companies designing their policy around fair AI, what does that look like in practice? So in the last 10 minutes or so of this talk, I'd like to show if we take this idea seriously, this algorithmic theory of justice seriously, what practical recommendations does it provide to companies designing policy around AI systems? And so let's look at examples of AI systems making lending decisions, AI systems that are generating images, and AI systems that are moving around in the world in autonomous vehicles. So the first example I want to focus on is a lending procedure or a lending model. And this diagram I find to be very clear, but for some reason nobody else does. So I want to say I'm the one who's in the wrong here, and I will explain this as best as possible. So here we have two groups, Group A and Group B. And let's assume this is the entire population of the society. This is very unrealistic here. But let's assume that the whole population is 150 people, and there are 150 people in the society. There's 100 members of Group A and 50 members of Group B. Group A, I'm representing with circles. Group B, I'm representing with triangles. So all the circles are Group A, all the triangles are Group B. Now you see Group B is the minority. There's 1/3 of people in the population who's Group B, 2/3 who are in Group A. Good. Now what we're going to do is look at their true labels in terms of lending, which of them actually repay a loan. And here we have historical data about which people actually repay. I am plotting all of the members of this group along an x-axis, a shared x-axis, which here is their income. And so their income can be described as, say, $20,000 a year, $40,000 a year, $60,000 a year. And let's assume their income is only in increments of $10,000 a year. So nobody makes $25,000 a year. And so we see that, first of all, incomes in the society are unequally distributed, right? So on average, the income for Group A is higher than the average income for Group B. The distribution, the bell curve for Group A is centered around $60,000 to $70,000 a year. The average, the bell curve distribution for Group B in terms of salary is distributed around $40,000 to $50,000 a year. Good. So now I will show you in terms of this diagram which people in each of these groups actually did repay a loan. All of the members of the groups who did repay a loan are solid shapes. All of the people who did not repay a loan are hollow shapes. So all the solid circles, the black circles here are members of Group A who did repay the loan. All the hollow circles are members of Group A who did not repay the loan. All the solid triangles are members of Group B who did repay the loan. All the hollow triangles are members of Group B who did not repay the loan. So this is one way of illustrating a distribution of both salary and also repayment. Now, what we want to do with our model is we want to learn the cutoff that's going to maximize overall true positives and true negatives and minimize the errors. And so in this system, we just have one feature in the data, which is income along the x-axis. In reality, there would be many, many dimensions here, but we're just looking at one dimension, which is the x-axis, score of salary. So where does it draw the line? I will just tell you that a machine learning procedure will discover that the optimal place to draw the cutoff in salary is where I've illustrated the dotted line here. Namely, give a loan to everyone who makes a salary of $50,000 or higher. Everyone who makes a salary of $40,000 or lower, reject for the loan. And that's the rule that a machine learning procedure will discover if you train it on this data set. However, we see that this produces some inequalities. First of all, we approve way more members of Group A than Group B. And there's an obvious reason for that. The distribution of incomes is skewed way more to the right for Group A than Group B. Another problem you realize is that the qualified members of Group A who actually do repay the loan are almost all approved. There's just that one dark circle up there at the top that makes $40,000 a year who would repay the loan who's rejected. Whereas there's a lot more hollow, or I should say solid triangles at $40,000 a year who deserve to get a loan but are rejected. Now, which metrics should we use to evaluate whether this machine learning procedure has discovered a fair rule? Well, again, I'm not going to go through the details here. I'm just going to illustrate there's a spectrum of different measurements that we could use, statistical measurements that we could use. From the most, let's call it progressive, which is a representation test, just saying, do the percentages of people that we approve for the loan match the percentages of people in the population? In the US, this is also called a quota. And it turns out that the representation test is unequal. We should get 2/3 of group A approved for the loan, 1/3 of group B approved for the loan, because that's what matches the demographics of the population. But here in this model, it's far from that, a little far from that. Selection rates are very unequal. So we've approved 91% of group A, but we've only approved half of the members of group B. Now, recall is a statistical measurement based on, of the qualified members of each group, how many of them get approved, or what percentage of them get approved. And it turns out, like I said before, 98% of the qualified members of group A are approved, only 76% of the qualified members of group B get approved. On the other hand, precision is this other statistical measurement that's less progressive and just says, of the people who you approved, what percentage of them are qualified? And there's actually not much inequality there. In fact, there's better outcomes of precision for group B than for group A. Now, what can we do here? Well, we can impose a fairness mitigation. And let's call this other model, model 2, where now we're doing what's called differential scoring. Let's shift the approval line for group B down a bit. So now the rule is for group A, if your salary is $50,000 or higher, you get the loan. For group B, if your salary is $40,000 or higher, you get the loan. Which of these is more fair? Or I should say, is this model M2 more fair than our alternative model M1? Well, in a lot of these metrics, yes. So it gets closer to representation. We get closer to that demographic of 2/3, 1/3. We get way better selection rates. So we still approve 91% of group A, but now we approve way more members of group B, way closer to parity. We also get much better recall. And precision actually goes down for group B. But in terms of some tests of equality, in the US, we can use a metric called the 4/5 rule, which is just a measurement of how close these numbers get to each other. This model actually passes all of those tests. However, you might say, at what cost? First of all, there's going to be a cost of accuracy. But second of all, there's also going to be a cost of discriminatory treatment, where we have some kind of differential scoring. Notice in model 1, we have equal thresholds for both groups. But in model 2, we've lowered the threshold for group B. And in that case, you might say there's some kind of differential scoring. Now, is that fair? Well, perhaps not in terms of equal treatment, but in terms of equal impact, it is. But I argue in my theory of algorithmic fairness that there are ways to actually impose this kind of fairness mitigation to get equal outcomes without worrying about unfair treatment. And here in this model, I actually claim that the members of group A who make $40,000 a year have no claim to what we call in the US disparate treatment. And the reason is they can't make a claim like the following: I would have been approved in a blind model, just maximizing purely for accuracy. Those members of group A who make $40,000 a year, they would have been rejected in a blind model. Now, it's true, they can say, if I were in group B, I would have been approved, which is sometimes classic grounds for what we call reverse discrimination. But I claim not necessarily approved in a blind model, even though approved in group B. And the kind of claim we care about is, would you have been approved in a blind model? Now, there are other kinds of things I have to say about these metrics and the conditions under which we can try to achieve equality of recall and equality of selection, even at the expense of sacrificing equal treatment and accuracy. But ultimately, that's what a company needs to do and say, what kinds of equality are we willing to sacrifice in the name of other kinds of equality, and which kinds of equalities matter most for our company and its decisions? This actually matters quite a bit also for image generators. So, for example, if you're having a generator that can generate images of doctors, if you say, make me an image of a doctor, well, what percentage of those doctors should be women? What percentage of those doctors should be members of minority race groups or minority ethnic and religious groups? Well, it depends on the fairness instructions that you give it. So the fairness instructions that Google and OpenAI briefly gave to their image generators was equal probability of appearance. And in the US, we define 5 different race groups, which is already problematic. But if you define 5 different race groups and you say every group should have equal probability of appearance in the images, then 20% of the doctors will be Black and 50% of the doctors will be women, regardless of the demographics in the population, regardless of the actual data that we see. On the other hand, you might say, well, let's try to have equal representation. So Adobe, in their image generator, part of their Firefly system, it does actually use this rule. And it says, well, we're going to try to match the demographics of the population. In that case, in the United States, 14% of the doctors, if you ask for a generic image of a doctor, will be Black, 37% will be women. On the other hand, you could have a policy that argues for equal qualified representation, in which case 6% of the doctors will be Black. And that's because in this case, you are looking at the actual state of the world rather than what you might call an ideal state of the world would be. Finally, you could say no mitigation, in which case, because of the sampling and labeling bias that we have in the data, you just have so few images of women doctors and minority race group doctors that it's going to be less than 6% or less than 37%. Now, as a company, once again, you can't run away from this decision, which Google did. Google essentially just took down their whole Gemini image generator system and said, we're not even going to try. We're just going to abandon all hope. That's a no-go, right? If you're building these systems, you need to say, here's what we consider to be fair representation in the images, and here's why. The last example I'll give is with autonomous vehicles. So once again, this is not about distribution of loans or distribution of images, but distribution of harms and risks to other vehicles. So this is the classic trolley problem, which is very silly for a lot of reasons, but it's a good way of illustrating when you are making real decisions about how close to drive to other cars or how fast to drive to other cars, what kinds of risks are you willing to impose on other vehicles? So imagine that you could swerve to avoid a wall, but in swerving to avoid the wall, you're going to hit this pedestrian. Here I have the values of -2 is the risk to the person in the car if they hit the wall. The value of -1 is the risk to the person in the car if they hit the pedestrian. The value of -90 is the risk to the pedestrian if you hit them. Now, if you have a principle which just says that we're going to essentially protect the people in the car at all costs, then you're happy to run into the pedestrian. Even though most of our principles of fairness will say that's unfair, because ultimately we are willing to impose some slight increase in risk on the person in the vehicle to prevent that large risk to the person on the street. But then we get into these weird cases where if you have to swerve to avoid a crowd of pedestrians who are each going to experience a 90% chance of death if you hit them, and hit the person on the side of the road where they will experience a 90% chance of death, then you get the utilitarian who is saying, well, we should swerve and hit the person on the side. The prioritarian who maximizes worst off outcomes will agree. But then if you change the outcomes where you get a slightly lower amount of risk to the pedestrians in front of you, then calculating the worst off harms, minimizing the worst off harms will actually prefer to run into the group of pedestrians, whereas you're minimizing the total amount of harms, you will prefer to swerve into the side of the road. Now, I will say that my own principle of justice produces some surprising conclusions in this scenario. Namely, I predict that the vehicle should actually crash into that crowd of pedestrians because it's better to give millions of people one broken leg than one person a single broken leg. And that's a weird, surprising prediction that my theory makes. But ultimately, I have to stand by it. And I will promise you that every other theory of fairness will produce some weird, surprising predictions. And that's also what companies need to do, and what I emphasize in my consulting work and my teaching that companies need to do. You need to be clear and explicit about here are the surprising predictions that my theory makes. Every theory is going to make some. I won't touch on this because I don't have time, but let's just say there are weird and surprising predictions that every theory needs to make. And ultimately what you need to do is stand by these predictions and say, here's why we think this is the right policy for us to move forward with as a company. Okay, so I will go ahead and end my talk there, and I look forward to any questions.
Free mic.
Okay, thank you, Professor Leben. Thank you so much for making time for us and for discussing everything in great detail with us. We greatly appreciate it. And then I want to open the floor for questions. If no one has questions, I have a couple of my own that I'd like to ask. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with my first one. Do you think that obviously the system would help managing ethical risks within corporate governance, like you said, right? So that you clearly showed throughout your talk. My question is just, in what ways do you think that human biases will influence that decision-making process? And also, how do you think, for instance, with a car, right? It would obviously, the manufacturers of the car would want to protect the customers and the consumers actually driving in the car because it's in their best interest. So these types of decision-making would definitely affect like the fairness and the corporate governance aspect of ethics. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so those are two important points you're raising. One of them having to do with sort of bias and human decision making, the other having to do with corporate liability and responsibility here. So I'll talk about both. You know, when we talk about bias, there's a lot of ways that bias comes in. It could come into the way that models are designed in terms of the sampling of data, the labeling of data, or even the usage of the models themselves. One appealing reason to use automated systems is that they might be, this is a point that John Kleinberg and his colleagues made in a famous paper called Discrimination in the Age of Algorithms, that we might think that machines can correct human bias in some way. So if you're using an automated system for hiring or for lending, you might say, well, actually, this can help to correct for human bias in a lot of ways. And that's one appeal of them, that we can go in and audit these systems in a way where we can't audit human beings. So when it comes to human decisions, how do I know that gender or race or disability wasn't playing a role in that hiring manager's decision? It's very difficult, if not impossible, to audit someone's mind, a human being's mind. But with an AI system, it's actually more plausible to go in and audit the system with these XAI methods or explainable AI methods, and also look at the outputs of the system in testing data and try to use the system to, in some way, mitigate human bias. Now, when it comes to humans using that system, you're correct. Often companies will say, well, this is just a tool. We're giving human beings this tool for hiring, this tool for lending, this tool for driving, or, you know, a tool even for medical applications, that doctors should use this as a tool. They shouldn't over rely on it. Now, part of that is obviously liability. They want to say, if the car crashes, like Tesla says, if the car crashes, it's the driver's fault, not ours, because the person should have been keeping their hands on the wheel and their eyes on the road at all times. If you use our tool for hiring or lending, and it makes mistakes or there's inequalities or injustices, then we might say, well, it's your responsibility. But once again, we have to say, well, as a company that's designing this tool or designing this system, what obligations do you have to ensure that that tool is actually contributing to safe practice and to fair practices? And I think that companies actually have a lot more liability when it comes to ensuring safety and fairness, even in the usage of these systems. If you sell a tool to a company and it leads to unfair outcomes, I think that companies who make that tool actually have a lot more responsibility there than just saying, well, it's the user's fault. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I also have two other questions. I do, as you know, critical theory, so I am much more interested in how technology shapes the way that we think and engage with the world. And I'm not one of those critical theorists that thinks that we're going to become passive or unthinking subjects, but I do think that it does influence the way that we think about and engage with the world, right? So my concern is that instead of saying like we become unthinking subjects, that we become more and actually escalate that industrial rationality or the quantification of our decision making and our human abilities and what makes us human, basically. And we already see this in capitalism. So do you think that we can mitigate that, or do you think that this will also just become a more exaggerated way, or how do we think we should mitigate that type of risk?
Yeah, I would say there's a more sort of optimistic road we could go down with employing technology and human decision making, and a more pessimistic or dystopian way we can go with incorporating technology. And so the optimistic, well, let's start with the pessimistic way, rhetorically speaking. So the pessimistic way is that we just defer more and more to our tools. This is, of course, in psychology known as automation bias, that I get these systems that can make decisions for me, that can drive my car, that can make hiring and lending decisions for me, that can do all my work for me. And I just defer more and more to it. And I just passively sort of accept the inequalities that are part of that system. And I throw up my hands and say, well, that's historical inequality. What are we going to do? It's just, that's the world we live in. Oh, well, but it gives me, faster and cheaper production. And so this is what we care about. And that's a very depressing kind of road to go down, where, well, like you said, I think that's a road where we live in a kind of dystopian society. A more optimistic route is, I think, like you hinted at, where technology actually causes us to become even more critical and more aware of our current practices than we even have been in the past. And I think of this in my own life sometimes, where I'm using AI or technology to do things, and it causes me to reflect more on the nature of that decision, the nature of that task. And I think, okay, well, what is this that I'm doing? What sorts of assumptions were going into this already? And what is acceptable here? So even in the examples I talked about with like risk and inequality, you get into a car, you drive around and you think, well, I'm just imposing risks on other people. That's something I accept. But the introduction of the car into our society over 100 years ago was something which was generally not even discussed or reflected on. And now, tens of thousands of people die on roadways in each country every year. And we just sort of accept that as the cost of having vehicles. It's just what happens. We live in a society with cars. But this can actually cause us to stand back and reflect on this. And some people who engineer autonomous vehicles have done that and said, hey, should we accept this? Should we accept this kind of risk that we expose people to every day that we get in a car? What kinds of risks are acceptable to impose on other people? And the same with inequality, right? Where we might say, well, if we have human hiring managers and human hiring decisions and human lending decisions, we might just accept, well, yeah, there's inequalities in our society, and these inequalities get baked into salary data. And so if we're using salary to determine loans, then we're going to give more loans to men than women, and to white Americans than Black Americans. But designing a model might force us to actually re-examine that and say, hey, wait, why was this acceptable at all? Like, why was our practice that we've been doing for decades, why were we okay with this? And that's the more optimistic route that I hope that humans go down with technology, is that technology actually forces us to become more conscious, more aware, more mindful of our decisions and practices in business and in everyday life too. My more hopeful moments.
I just want to check, does anyone else have some questions?
Yes, I would like to ask something. Derek, thank you very much for your, especially the examples. I think it makes it more accessible and understandable. It is very complicated though, but I just want to understand your model or your proposed model is based on Rawls's theory. is the whole idea that that model will be introduced into the AI system, or is that it will automatically make decisions according to Rawls's theory, or is it something that can be done after the AI generates its responses, if it's sort of constructing new knowledge?
Yeah, good. So what I have in mind is that this is a theory that people will use in the design process, in the process of designing and evaluating AI systems. I don't think that the system itself would necessarily have any of this theory incorporated inside of it. Instead, it's a theory that people who are building the systems and evaluating the systems would use in saying, okay, how much accuracy do we owe people in a minimal level of accuracy? Like when we're designing the system, it's just going to tell us simple measurements like what's the level of accuracy, what's the recall rate, what's the selection rate, what's the representation look like? And it's up to humans who are building and evaluating the system to say, well, what do we care about with AI systems? Do we care about enforcing equality of selection rates? Do we care about enforcing equality of recall? Do we care about a minimal level of accuracy? If so, what does that look like in different areas? How do we audit the model using these counterfactual tests for protected features? Which features count as protected, right? The AI system is not going to contain any of that information. Instead, it's the humans who are actually evaluating it. So let me give you another example, which is in New York City, there was a local city law passed in 2021 that went into effect in 2023, which requires that every company that that uses an AI system, not just designs an AI system, that deploys an AI system for hiring practices, must satisfy equal selection rates across protected groups. Now, I think actually this is a very noble standard, but too strict in most cases. So I think equal selection rates are very good. And if there's no sacrifice to these other ideas, then that's something we should strive for. But usually equal recall is what I advocate. Now, what that means is what metric should we use when evaluating these systems? And actually, we could build constraints into the model during the training phase itself. And in fact, a lot of companies do this, which is to say, I'm going to optimize the model for accuracy, but constrained such that it has the most accuracy, given that it also satisfies equality of recall. And it's that kind of guidance that I think the theory will give us.
Thank you. I understand. Because I just thought if you look at it an open system and you introduce a particular model or theory into it, won't it start learning from that and also start using, you mentioned there are always exceptions to a model and some strange results that you get from the model. Won't it start learning from that and introduce other metrics to the system? But I don't know enough about AI, so I'm just interested whether that is possible.
Yeah, so one thing we could say here is in machine learning, there's a difference between systems that have a learning phase, which is called online learning. Well, sorry, batch learning, where you just train the system on a set of historical data, and then you have a program, and you just run the program, and the program doesn't change. So, for example, one common misconception about like ChatGPT is that it's learning when you're interacting with it. To some extent, that's true because the responses you give in the API, the company actually uses to train its next system. But the program itself is fixed, right? So the weights and parameters of the system are always fixed when you interact with it. And OpenAI is then using your responses to train GPT-5, the next version of it. But then there are also machine learning procedures that are called online learning procedures, which do learn in the wild. This is more rare. So usually you won't get that kind of learning that happens. But you're right that, even with batch learning, if the company is taking people's responses, the way they interact with these systems, and using it as training data for the next phase of their model, like your GPT-5, your DALL-E 4, then you will get, in fact, a kind of feedback effect, which is, I think, what you have in mind here. And this could be good, right? I'm hoping that actually, if we are developing responsible practices around the use of AI, that could start a feedback loop. And I mean, that's part of the goal of fairness mitigation in general, is that actually introducing more fair practices into companies' behavior, into their decisions, will have a virtuous spiral. It'll start this sort of feedback loop that feeds on itself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Back to you, Donnell.
Okay, and I have one or two last questions. So I think that this is a great model that would definitely work within an American context, right? And you refer a lot to roles, and I think maybe Sen, but even Sen uses a lot of Western thought frameworks. So I'm just wondering, is there any sort of mindfulness that we should have about employing this type of learning or model within other contexts? Because I think, for instance, in South Africa, our idea of what fairness means might look very different from an American context. We see this especially with like Kwazi Reredu critiquing human rights from the United Nations. So I would just like to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And, the first thing I'll note, even in just comparing, fairness and injustice in the context of the US and South Africa, I sometimes find this even just in giving talks. Sometimes my colleagues will talk about, minority groups as if minority and oppressed group are synonymous, but that's not the case, right? Sometimes you have the group that has been historically oppressed is the majority group. And we see important differences there around the world as well. So here I'll talk about, this important philosophical difference between what we might call ethical universalism or moral realism and some version of moral relativism. Now, that word can also sound pejorative at times, and I want to be careful about that. But yes, insofar as I am some kind of moral realist or moral universalist, my goal is to find a set of norms and an ethical theory that will, in some sense, be universal, that all human beings can agree to. And I mean, this is ultimately what, Rawls and Sen are trying to do. Well, they were trying to do. Is to discover that, and Rawls, obviously, through this mechanism of the original position, that was his idea. Now, this has been criticized, justifiably so, as being too abstract, ignoring the actual facts and details of people's historical experiences, their real psychology, their real psychological and cultural differences. And this is a struggle also between, well, we want to, in some ways, incorporate and adjust accordingly to different norms and values across the world. While at the same time, we want to appeal to some kind of universal human values or human rights. And this can sometimes just boil down to an old philosophical difference between relativism and realism, or relativism and universalism. And I will be, upfront that I'm on, team universalism when it comes to that, and that my goal and my hope is to find some universal set of norms that all human beings can converge upon. While at the same time, I'm very mindful of the criticisms, also that, when we are trying to develop these universal norms just through sort of passive introspection, based on our own imagining what people would rationally try to agree to within this hypothetical bargaining position, that's going to incorporate a lot of subjective biases, and I think that's very problematic. So, in fact, I think that this project should take place in constant dialogue and debate with people in different regions of the world. And I found this even in doing consulting work, that norms around privacy, norms around data usage are radically different sometimes. And I've even had to revisit my own ideas about this myself. where I've started out with these sort of very Western views about data ownership and privacy. And then I, travel and I do work in East Asia, and there's very different norms around data ownership and usage there, and these kinds of practices. I don't want to be paternalistic. I don't want to be colonial. I don't want to come in and say, well, these are universal practices, and you must all care about ownership and data privacy, even if you don't. I want to be very aware of that, and that's a serious danger that comes with, like you said, this sort of universalist approach to ethics. Yeah.
Well, since you brought that up, my next question was actually going to be on the dangers of privacy, because in South Africa, we are very, very strict about privacy of information, anonymity, and all that kind of stuff. But here I see that you will require a lot of access to data, and also thinking again about how aware consumers are when they say that they are voluntarily giving up their digital information. And I think that South Africa's privacy laws are actually a little bit more stricter than America's. So I'm just wondering, like, what implications do you see there?
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that I approve of, for example, companies collecting data about your calling behavior and your geolocation data. I actually think that there are significant ethical problems with this. And I agree with you that there are certain kinds of data, and this usually shocks most audiences when I say this, which is there are certain kinds of data that are wrong to access even with consent. There's a certain kind of libertarian view which says, well, with consent, all is permissible. If you agree to let me use your data, your geolocation data, to make lending and hiring decisions about you, then that's fine. Now, of course, there are important questions about consent. When consent is actually present, when do people really understand? When are they not under the subject of coercive pressure? But I actually want to go further than that and say that I think there are some kinds of data which are dehumanizing and disrespectful to use, even if people consent to them. Now, when it comes to fairness and my theory of algorithmic fairness, I actually have some justification for this based on non-discrimination. So when we talk about location data, for example, what makes that relevant to making a lending decision about you? Now, companies might say, well, it's statistically relevant. Our machine learning procedure discovered that people who tend to drive around at night more often are less likely to repay a loan. Even if that's true, I actually want to say that it's not conceptually relevant. It's not the kind of thing that is relevant to the task of making loans, making lending decisions. And because of that, we just shouldn't look there. We shouldn't access that data, even if it's with consent and even if it's statistically relevant. And so that's my position, which actually is a lot more restrictive than I think what most companies are currently doing with data in the US. So I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't think you were implying that we should just have access to data, but I just want to make sure there's no other questions. Right, then I just want to say a special thank you to Prof. Mark Rathbone for the introduction and welcome, and then thank you to Dr. Yanni van Vyver who helped with organizing the event, and then of course thank you so much, Derek, for making time for us and engaging with us. We'll definitely look forward to your book, AI Fairness, Designing Equal Opportunity Algorithms, and MIT Press this year, right?
Yep.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes. Mark, do you want to say
just
something?
from my side, I would just like to thank you for initiating this meeting and for all the arrangements. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Oh,